All right, we are live. Hi, Chris. How you doing? Can you hear me okay, Chris? Uh-oh, technical difficulty. Can you hear me? Uh-oh. Okay, say something back here real quick. Let's check
I can't
there.
hear you, Chris. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you can't hear me. That's a strange thing to happen. Okay, well, we do need to make sure that works. So let me and unmute myself. Hi, can you hear me now?
No, I can't hear you on anything, Chris.
Well, this will be very interesting then. Okay, let's see. So can't hear me. Let me change some stuff around. Let me see something here real quick. Let's
Nope,
see.
still got nothing.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, they can hear me on the stream. You can't hear me. So here.
Hello,
Give us 1
hello.
second to work this out. I just need to tell him to make sure his headphones are working.
There we go. I've got you now.
Oh, you can hear me now.
Yep, I can hear you now.
Excellent. Okay, so we are live. So everybody, minus the slight problems in the beginning there, I am Chris from the Black Ocean. We're here with Chris from Warcradle, who will be answering your questions. So make sure you post what you want to ask in the chat. I'm going to ask him a couple questions so you guys can kind of get your questions ready and post them up. So the first thing is I would like to ask you, Chris, what's your basic background and how did you come to work for Warcradle?
Well, hobby-wise, my interest in tabletop gaming started a little over 30 years ago when I got a copy of Hero Quest. I think for my when I was 10. For Christmas, I got it, and that was really what got me into gaming, and then on to things like Dungeons and Dragons and fighting fantasy books, and then I discovered Warhammer and a whole load of other games, and yeah, I've been gaming ever since. Tabletop, wargaming, board gaming, role playing, card games, anything I can uh, get into really. So um, I then applied for a role as the operations supervisor for Wayland Games just over 8 years ago, and started getting involved with the studio from the get go. And I've been studio manager, well, assistant studio manager now for 3 years.
All right. So, what sci-fi has inspired you?
Um, well, I've always really been interested in sci-fi, even as a kid. Obviously, Star Wars was a big influence when I was younger. But more recently, I've read a lot of Ian Banks uh, sci-fi books, Peter F. Hamilton. They're kind of my main influences now from a sci-fi perspective.
All right. And then how did you become involved in Firestorm Armada?
I actually started playing Firestorm Armada 5 or 6 years ago. I fell in love with the Ryushi, especially the big battle carrier that was an enormous miniature, and built a fleet around that. And we had a big community at the store. We would play on a weekly basis. There were lots of us who would get involved. We did some campaign play, and we we had a good kind of 6, 8, 10 months run where we would play little else apart from Firestorm Armada. But the releases kind of dried up, and I think people just found other games, and that kind of fell apart a little bit. And it's lovely to be able to rekindle that passion for the game in creating a new version, which is excellent.
All right. Well, speaking of that, I noticed that we've had some, probably the biggest change in version point 0.5 of the beta is that the system damage had a rewrite in this version. Can you go through those changes and kind of explain how that changes the game?
Yeah, from a big, uh, I'll go back to the start of the alpha when we were rewriting the rules and looking at what we can keep and what we can change and what things we might want to have a look at some different options for. Now, one of the biggest changes that we made in Wild West Exodus was the lifeblood system, so how damage was dealt. And it's one of the biggest um, uh, bookkeeping elements of any game is health. How many hit points something's got, how many wounds it's taken, and we wanted to try, or we always want to try and make our games as quick and as fluid as possible to try and speed the games up, to stop any kind of slowdown where you have to manage, to take 1 or 2 points, or people counting up, people counting down, that type of thing. And what we did with Wild West Exodus, as some of you may know, is it's a one hit, one kill deal, and it certainly works for Wild West Exodus, and it wouldn't work for Firestorm Armada necessarily. So what we wanted to do was have a look at some options, and this system damage option was something that we really enjoyed in the alpha tests. And although there is still some bookkeeping, there's still stuff on the table, there are still dice that go next to the ships. Um, so it doesn't necessarily cut down on that a huge amount. It is we really enjoy the system and the way it works, and it makes for, some ships can hang around for a very long time when they're repairing the damage, and it allows player choice, which is one of the biggest things for us in any game that we're working on, is making sure that the choices with the player, the tactical choices are there, and that there isn't a no-brainer in any decision that a player has to make. There are always options and there are always tactical decisions that need to be made, and that's one of the things that you get with the system damage. Do you plow as much damage into one ship even though there's a good chance it's going to die at the end of the phase? But if you get a lucky repair roll, that can always keep it in the game. So do you then move on to another ship, or do you go for a catastrophic explosion? Nothing is certain, and that's one of the things that we wanted to go for. And it's absolutely, this is a beta test, so none of this is set in stone. None of the systems that we have, none of the mechanics that really in place are as they're going to be in the final version of the game. As it's a beta test, whatever people are playing at the moment, we're just testing mechanics. We're kicking the tires. We're playing around with some ideas, and every week, as we're modifying it and changing it and updating it, we're letting people have a go at a slightly different variation on what we've come up with, and seeing how that goes down. Because no matter how much we play test this in house, we get a much better response from the community. We get so many more players who are getting involved in the game through the beta test, and we're getting some fantastic results from people and some really, really in-depth feedback, which is fantastic. So thank you everybody who has joined in with the beta test so far. I really appreciate all the hard work that everyone's been through. There are some names that have come up almost every single week. You probably know who you are. I'm not going to name names, but thanks again for sticking with it, and hopefully you'll continue to give us the input, and hopefully you'll be pleased to see that your comments have been listened to, and that we are making changes based on those. And we are already coming up with some great things that we hadn't considered, or that we'd kind of moved away from when we were doing the alpha test for whatever reason. And one of the biggest things about creating a game is everything that we do is based on our own opinion, and that's true of anything. As an individual, you have an opinion on something. Yeah, I have a preference for things, and the rest of the team in the studio have certain preferences. And it might be that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet on a number of different things, and therefore we don't really entertain some other options, which is why opening it up to a larger community means we get opinions from other people. You can't please all the people all the time, but what we try and do is make a balanced, enjoyable, fun rule set that people will enjoy and is accessible to as many people as possible, so that you'll have more people to play against in the stores, and that stores will have communities, and those communities will drive engagement, and engagement drives sales, and therefore it becomes a snowball effect, and people start to play the game more and more every week. And with the ongoing release schedule that we plan to have for all of our games, it means that there's always something there that will drive people's imagination and will get people maybe looking to start that new faction, or to complete the existing faction that they have, or to build a new type of fleet and try something slightly different. That was a long answer, Chris.
That was a good answer, though, and I also like to thank everybody who's participating in both the feedback for the beta and watching on the live streams. And a little bit of housekeeping on that. I'm gonna post this up for the people who are looking at Facebook. You'll need to give StreamYard access if you want your name in the feed. So I can still post the comments up. I just can't see your name when it comes up. So along those lines, first question says Facebook user, right? When might we see some beta ships from the other factions?
Well, currently the beta is really focused on the rules of the game rather than the different factions. So the factions that we've got in there are, I don't want to use the term placeholders because they're a little bit more than that, but they aren't, they're by no means the final look of those factions that are going to be in the game. And really they're just there to allow you to have some different rules to play against. So actually the beta isn't just a vanilla frigate, cruiser, battleship, generic stat line, that there is actually a bit of flavor in there. um, might be something that we'll have a look at if you guys are interested in having a look at some variation. But just be aware that anything that we put through in the beta isn't likely to necessarily find its way into the final game in its existing form in the beta test, because really the beta test is there to test the rules, not the faction rules, not the faction feel. And rest assured that when the factions do come out in the game, where as it gets released, every faction will have its own flavor, every faction will have its own kind of play style. The ships within the different factions will feel different, certainly for some factions more than others. And yeah, so bear with us while we go through the beta test, and just bear in mind that we are beta testing the core rules of the game rather than the factions.
All right. So our next question comes from my good friend. He's actually a local from here. His name is Meh. Is there any expanded universe plan for the new game, i.e., comics, novels, etc.?
It's very early days, and that all depends on the popularity of the game, really. Um, if things really take off, then absolutely we're going to look at as much to expand the universe as we can. And we are having a huge amount of fun creating these backgrounds for the different factions, and the flavor and feel um, of the world, the universe, sorry, the galaxy as it is, for Firestorm Armada. And it's one of the coolest parts of being part of the studios, to see things unfold, looking at the concept art for the different factions, for the ships, and for the backgrounds, and the coming up with different ways of making this feel like a really immersive um, universe to play in.
All right. And now we got another one from a Facebook user. I'm going to actually look on Facebook and see who this is from. This is from Gary Downing. And it said, will the Terrans be the shield race in this edition like previous editions?
Again, it's difficult to say at the moment. Certainly, every single race will have its own thing. It will have its own flavour and its own feel, and there's no reason why we would necessarily move away from the way they were in the previous edition. So that is probably a fairly hesitant yes to answer to that question, because I just don't know at the moment. Nothing is set in stone, nothing is laid down, but there's no reason why they wouldn't yet.
All right. I'm going to grab another one here. How many people at Warcradle are working on the rules? Are they play testing themselves?
Yes, absolutely. We have a studio of around 12 people, and we have um, additional add-on staff as well who are kind of just outside of that sphere. So there are a lot of people who are involved in the process, and not all of them are rules writers, not all of them are playtesters, but most people who work in the studio are interested in the hobby, and we get a whole mess of us involved in playtesting. So especially on the alpha test before we release the beta, there are lots of us playtesting and playing the game, and obviously we're still continuing to do so now. So yes.
Excellent. Okay. So we've got one more here from just a general use from, sorry, the Firestorm Armada group. What point values are going to be standard game sizes?
Well, again, it's a very difficult question to answer right now, because none of those things have been finalized. So we have a general idea of how many points a battleship is going to be, and a cruiser and a frigate, a destroyer, corvette, a carrier, super carrier, a heavy carrier, all these different types of ships that we have, kind of nebulous, almost finalized concepts for points wise and rules wise. But until we actually nail that down, and once we've got the rules finalized and we've got the betas finished and we kind of know where the rules are going to be, that's where the rule work begins almost, and we start to really build on each faction and make sure that we have um you know the final faction flavors and the balance of the points costs and how that's all going to work out. So right now, that would be a very difficult thing to say for a number. I mean, I could tell you it would be 1,000 points. I could tell you it would be 1,200 points, but without knowing what a battleship costs, that it wouldn't really put it into perspective. The one thing that I can say is we want to try and get this game to the table as often as is humanly possible. One of the big challenges for that is time. I personally have got a full-time job. I've got 3 kids at home, so my time to play games is fairly limited. I very rarely get a whole weekend. Well, I never get a whole weekend to play games. I very rarely get a full day to play games. So I can manage an evening, and I like to, if I'm playing a tabletop game, I like to be able to finish my game in an evening session. And realistically, by the time I start an evening session of gaming, it will be about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and I'll realistically finish at about 10:30 or 11. So that gives us a window of maybe 3 hours to ensure that a decent game is, played. And when you're talking about setting up time and packing down time, realistically, you want a good game to last you 2 hours.
Yeah,
And
that seems about the sweet spot for
yeah,
most games,
Absolutely. You know, we don't want to create a game that means you have to spend 6 hours to play a full decent sized game. So the way we've looked at it, we want some, a decent fleet on the table, a good sized fleet, and that would probably be two or three large ships, a couple of squadrons of medium ships, and again a couple of squadrons of smaller ships. So you might have 25 ships, maybe 30 ships on the table, maybe even 20, depending on the way you want to build your fleet out. That's kind of the ballpark of what we see as a good, solid game. But there are some people who want to play a game in an hour and a half, and those people might only want to have, a battleship, two or three cruisers, and maybe one or two units of frigates, something like that. Um, and we want to therefore make a game that scales really well. We want to make a game that works at that size, and it works at the kind of the sweet spot, if you like, the 3 hour game, two to 3 hour game. And we also want to cater for people who do want to have a massive weekend bash and just get as many players as possible and put a load of spaceships on the table and actually spend 48 hours doing nothing but playing Firestorm Armada. So uh, we always have that in mind when we're making a game. We want to make sure that the scalability is there, and that's one of the biggest things that we managed to get right with Wild West Exodus. You can play that game with a handful of miniatures. You can play it with 15 to 20 miniatures. You can play it with an entire army on one side of the table and the same on the other, and it works really well at all levels. And really, the only difference is time, because everything else is just kind of falls into place. The alternate activations of the game work really well. So, your opponents aren't spending 2 hours waiting for you to do turn one. And, so that's really what we're aiming for. And therefore, the points will kind of tie into that. So we'll make sure everything's balanced, but we set that points value. So that average game is going to be around that kind of ballpark, and the points will fall into place around it.
All right, good answer. So here we go. We got another one. This one says Facebook user. The Storm Zone Coalition keeps getting better and better with addition of more races. How many races do you have planned? They really
Um,
want to know.
what we don't want to do is make a rod for our own backs. The more races we add to the coalition, the more miniatures we're going to have to make before it becomes a faction that is cohesive and worthwhile playing. Um, and actually, it's one of the more interesting factions for us because of the diversity, and you've got some really interesting factions in there. At the moment, we are, I don't want to say never, but we're quite happy with the way things are with the current factions as the backgrounds stand. Doesn't mean that we're not going to look at adding more if more come along, but it certainly would be one of the factions that would be easy to push the boundaries on and to start adding some more bits too. But again, we don't want everybody to be coalition players. We want everybody to want to play every faction, which is why you may have noticed that every faction, even though they are just one race, have got a kind of number of sub races or subdivisions or different flavors within the same race that mean that you're not going to get bored playing one particular race. If you play the Ceruleans, you will have a variety of different fleet builds going forward that will allow two Cerulean players to play against each other, and hopefully they will be able to field very different fleets and not just be fighting against the same rules over and over again. So, having that variation within the factions is quite important for us, because we want to make sure that we capture engagement for our player base. And there's no better way of doing that than getting people hooked on a particular feel of something that they enjoy, a facet of that faction that really captures their imagination and wants them to see, that theme of the fleet build and how that particular faction plays on the tabletop. Whether you're the aloof, arrogant Vaedreth, or whether you're the bloodthirsty Bakash, raiding against whoever and whenever they like. Um, and so there will be variety within every faction. Now that's quite easy to do with the Storm Zone Coalition, but you'll have it in every faction that we have.
Okay, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot too. I'm going to ask you which faction lore wise is your favorite?
It's the Vaedreth for me. Um, I really enjoy. I love the look of the ships. I love the way they are quite different. And one of um, one of my concerns with Firestorm Armada initially was a lot of the ships looked quite similar. They were all fairly much the same shape. And when we started down this road, that was one of the things we wanted to have a look at. We really wanted to make ships that looked different and had a very different aesthetic to them. And the Vaedreth really do capture that. They've got that kind of vertical look to some of the ships, not all of them, to some of the ships. And they've got a real aggressive look, almost like they are shards of glass that are waiting to slice through their enemies. There we go. That kind of look to the Vaedreth, and also the background. Just love that kind of ancient, um, archaic, almost anachronistic empire that has, you know, done almost everything, and are kind of just wandering around looking for an excuse to obliterate somebody from space. So yeah, they're my go-to faction at the moment. But every time we work on a background piece, I start to get excited about that faction. So there's loads of really cool stuff there.
All right, we got another one. This one's from Jason Carter. I think you've already answered this. I just wanted to make sure that we get that up on the screen. You kind of answered before you asked.
Yes, Jason, that's a very familiar name. As I've been working through the beta, Jason has been one of the um, very regular and very what's the word I want to use? He's been very in depth with his responses and his write ups of the games that he's been playing. So thank you, Jason, for everything you've done so far. Keep up the great work. But yes, I hope I have answered that for you. Um, and just again to reiterate the fact that we want to make the game work, no matter what kind of size game or length of game you want to play. We want to ensure that you have the opportunity to play those games. So we'll bear that in mind, certainly.
All right, and now we have another one. This one's again says Facebook user. I'll find the user's name here real quick. But many stats seem to have a narrow range of possible values. For example, a shield of 3 or 4. How do you plan to fit so many ship classes in that space and have them have a different feel?
Well, there are quite a number of stats for any ship. Um, having just if there were a limited number of stats and having a limited range, then that would be a problem. But we have a lot of stats that we can use, and actually the difference between shield value 3 and 4 is quite big, um, and the range between 3 and 5 is enormous. It's a gulf. They just changing the number a little bit makes a big difference. And what you might find is that the shield ratings or certain stats will be different across factions, but not necessarily across the different class of ship. So fear not when the final stats come out for all the different factions, you'll have more than enough flavor within those factions and across the different classes to make them feel unique. And we don't just have those particular stats to play around in. We've got a whole load of things that will hang off those stat lines for the different classes. So I'm sure it'll be fine.
All right, we have another question from Meh. I know it's extremely early to say, but what kind of price point are you looking for the miniatures?
Yes, it is extremely early to say. What we want to do, and again, this is something that we think a lot about, and we put a lot of thought into it for Wild West Exodus, and we put a lot of thought into it for Dystopian Wars. So finding accessibility is the key, making sure that the product can get into as many people's hands as possible, and recruitment is part of that. So getting the Wild West Exodus had a lot of characters that were in blisters, and a blistered character has a lot of cost involved in producing that product that's tied up in just one miniature. So we found that we could do a whole posse of characters, 6 or 7 characters, for around the 35 to £40 mark, so kind of $45 mark or thereabouts, which instead of having an individual character, about 15 or £12 to £15. So it meant that it became more accessible to people. It was easier for people to get a full force on the table financially than it was previously. And we will continue that mindset as the business develops with different games. So while I can't really say what the price point is going to be, um, rest assured that a fleet box will, hopefully be somewhere around that same mark, something that is affordable for people, something that is really good value for money, and allows us to get as many people playing the game as we possibly can. And not only do the miniatures have to look incredible, the rules have to be solid, but it also has to be affordable for people to go, yeah, I'm definitely in, that's fine. I'm quite happy to put that amount of money down on a starter fleet so I can start playing the game. So while I can't give you a specific answer to that question, I hope that really gives you an idea of the spirit of the question.
All right, this also segues nicely into what you just were talking about. We've got from Facebook user Roberto's artwork for the actual races is stunning. Are there any plans to release the races as minis, even if it's just Christmas collectibles?
I would love to. I would absolutely love to get our guys sculpting these incredible races. Um, Creating something that doesn't have a place on the table, and selling that product is, however, quite difficult. So, we would have to have a look at that and see, how many people will be interested in purchasing those miniatures. They would be maybe a one-off 75 mil resin miniature that would be fantastically detailed. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. It's not necessarily. We got so much stuff to focus on at the moment that's in the periphery. But we have spoken about doing something similar in the past. It certainly is something that we could do. But it would just depend whether it would be commercially viable for us to produce something like that, because there's a lot of work that goes into creating a miniature to get it sculpted, to then do the tests, to get it into production, get packaging for it. You know, there's a whole range of things that have to be thought out. And if they're not going to have a place on the tabletop, then the number of people buying them is going to be considerably less, because it will be just down to people who are that way wired and really want to collect everything for their particular faction, or maybe some miniature painters who really want to have something different to get their brush busy on. Um, but yeah, again, never say never. It's certainly something that we will consider. But at the moment, we don't have any solid plans for that. No, and there are some of them.
Some of that amazing artwork right there. And let me get this one here. We have from Facebook user, at which stage of the beta will terrain rules be available?
Um, very, very soon. That's in fact something we are working on at the moment. So you'll see some terrain rules very shortly. And you know, this goes back to what I was talking about with opinions. For me personally, I I have a I have a problem with terrain in a space combat game at this scale, because space is enormous and there's a lot of space in space. The things that are in space are insignificant in relation to the things that aren't in space.
Hey,
So
Chris, let me interrupt you for one real quick second. A couple of my friends from the old podcast we used to do, the Black Ocean podcast, I think it was Scott who used to say this. He said, space is a big place.
yeah, so having having asteroids and planetoids and planets, I mean, it just I really struggle with the concept of that. Now, having said that, it is a tabletop game. And one of the things that we worked through was having environments instead of terrain. So when you play a game, that game is in a certain environment. It might be a nebula. It might have it might have a comet that's streaking through the middle of the battlefield, and there might be a black hole. I don't know. There are certain things that we can introduce, which will mean that when you play that game, the rules of that game will be different to the rules of another game that you might play, a Firestorm Armada, with a different environment. And for me, I'm much more comfortable with that as a thing than having terrain. Having said that, that's just my opinion. And I'm well aware that my opinion isn't shared with everybody in the world. So as a result, a lot of people have been asking about terrain, and last week we were talking through different terrain and talking about getting some of the terrain put into the beta test and seeing how we go with it. And if it's super popular and people love it, then absolutely that's something that we will put into the game. If people don't want to play with terrain, that's fine. They don't have to play with terrain. And if people go to tournaments, then the TO will have to um, be really clear about what rules are being used, and what terrain is going to be set up on the tables and that type of thing. But that's the same can be said for any game really, when you're looking at tournament play. But most of the time, people playing with their friends, they're playing down at the club with people that they game with every single week, or their local store. They'll just play with however they want to play. It's your game, play it your way. That's how we look at it. So but we want to make sure that we cater for as many people as possible. So that is certainly something that we're looking to get put into the rules.
Yeah, for me, I like the kind of thought along the lines. I've been watching The Expanse again lately, and I like kind of that feeling where it's empty depending on if you've decided to fight around the environment. So, like for instance, in The Expanse, when they decide to fight around let's say, a space station, that kind of terrain would be something that I would be interested into playing against. But I can see your point too, where space is so huge that you could easily just entirely miss a system at the speed of light, the speeds that we're going. So,
And of course, the scale makes a difference as well, because
correct.
this is a huge scale the way with Firestorm Armada. So and actually, if you look at an asteroid belt, the Kuiper belt, the asteroids are thousands of kilometers apart. There aren't, you don't have an asteroid field necessarily the way you would see in something like Star Wars. Those kind of things are very, very few and far between, because this stuff they just fly apart. Any kind of collision at any point in the millions of years that asteroid belt exists for, any momentum that those objects have will just fling them apart, and within a very short space of time, there is no dense um, collection of matter, unless of course it's caught in a some kind of gravitational pull, which again would come back to the environment that you're playing in. So that's something that we're working on throughout the beta, and that's something that you will soon be seeing in an update near you.
Awesome. So that kind of goes into the next thing that Jason's asking here. Have you been thinking about how to make SRS more integrated into the gameplay rather than an add-on system? And that's SRS is short range spacecraft, right? Is that
Yep,
correct? Okay.
yep.
Just wanted to make that clear for anybody who's looking at the first time.
I mean, I currently feel that SRS is integrated into gameplay. Um, uh, I suppose maybe what Jason means is it's an add-on system insofar as you only have them if you take carriers. So they aren't always there. And I suppose one way of doing that is to make ships that have SRS more prolific throughout the options that you have within the faction. So maybe battleships always carry um, a couple of squadrons of fighters ready to scramble, or SRS that are multi-use. So there'll be fighters, bombers, whatever you want to call them. They are essentially just small craft that are used on attack runs, or to increase defenses, or however they get used. So I suppose in that way, then yes, the only way to really do that is to ensure that there are more ships that have SRS, that have a carrier capacity, um, than more than just your carriers. And that's an interesting way of looking at things. And then if you do take carriers, it means you have even more tokens to play around with, and people can go for carrier heavy um, fleets if they want to. But of course, carriers, so a carrier that has SRS will probably have less devastating weaponry than a battleship that doesn't have so many SRS, or they will still have the weaponry, but the points values will be inflated to cover the fact that they also have the SRS tokens. So obviously, balance will figure into that in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, that would be the way to do that, Jason.
Awesome. So I have a maybe a final question for you here. What part of Firestorm Armada are you most excited about right now?
Well, I mean, right now the biggest part that we're working on is the system damage. That's one of the areas that has changed an awful lot, and it's one of the things that we really like. We really like the system damage and the way the system damage dice work, and the fact that um, your permanent damage that's being inflicted on this ship, the ships actually has a every single bit of damage you're doing has an impact. There is no superficial damage. There is no, oh, you just scratched the hull. Actually, if you're doing damage, something is being affected on the ship. And it gives it a very realistic feel to it. And one of the core facets for us, one of the biggest things that we're thinking about every single day, and every time we're working on the mechanisms, and every time we're working through the beta, is the fact that we want this to feel like a game in space rather than a naval game on a black tablecloth. And that's why we're making a lot of the decisions that we are, and that's why we're trying to make it feel like a space combat game. We can't make it in 3 dimensions. It's just not possible. We've thought a long, long and hard about how to do it, but you know, having ships at different levels and that it's very fiddly. It slows the game down, and it becomes a detraction from the game rather than anything else. And ultimately, with it is a game. It's not a simulation of real life, if you like, because a simulation is very different. This is a game. It has to be enjoyed as a game, and therefore a game has to abstract certain things to make it work. Um, and so making the game feel like it's not just a naval game in space is one of the biggest things that we're keen to develop and push forward. So that for me is the biggest challenge and also the most fun in this whole process is making it feel like a space game. And with the going back to you talking about my influence, my sci-fi influence. I don't know if any of you have read. I hope you have read Ian M. Banks' books, but they are the technology involved in some of the ships is phenomenally advanced to the point where humans are incapable of making the choices, and human decision making and thought process is too slow to even contemplate controlling the spacecraft at the level that they operate at. And, entire conflicts are carried out in seconds because these ships are so powerful, so fast, that it it would just mince a human mind to pulp to try and control anything at that speed. And that's not much fun to play on the tabletop, and it's difficult to get something like that um, to work as a game. So there have to be some abstractions. There have to be some things that feel much more like reality as we know it. So the world as we know it. The fact that I am a captain of a ship and I will command a helmsman to make the ship do a thing. And that's certainly the kind of thing that's happening. And it might be that the actual crew are hardwired into the machine, and that their thoughts, they don't have to communicate vocally. They can actually just be controlling the ship and giving the orders directly through a neural link, and that obviously speed things up. They might very well be unlike us humans today. They might well be enhanced in some way and have ways that allow them to control the functions of the ship at a more intuitive level rather than a joystick or a control pad or a panel of instruments. So um, that's for me is the biggest challenge and the most fun is to try and make Firestorm Armada feel like you're playing a space combat game rather than just another naval combat game in space.
Awesome. We have from Leon Peters Malone. If that's the answer on the SRS, we're playing two different games. As for system damage, don't suppose you guys ever played the B5 A Call to Arms game? game look. Not saying it's a bad idea. Just when you get into damage rolls, then type of damage, it doesn't end well. So I don't know if that was a question, but I think he's kind of addressing the SRS thing again.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, Leon, I'd really be interested in hearing your thoughts on part of the feedback. It sounds like you've got some bits there that are worthwhile elaborating on for me. So if you could submit your thoughts about SRS and about the damage, and kind of expand on that a little bit for me, that would be great. I'd really appreciate you doing that. And then we'll have a look at that and see if we can respond through the beta.
And then we have a Facebook user asking about what about the how do you feel about 12-sided dice?
I love D12. They're my favorite dice. In fact, I have D6s that are 12-sided dice with the pips on twice because I love rolling
Oh, that's
12-sided dice.
cool.
I love D12. Um, so yeah, it's my favorite dice. Facebook user. I don't know how you knew that, but yeah, it's absolutely my favorite dice. Um, so I mean, if you want to use the double d6 with 12 sides, then that's great. Just make sure your opponent's happy with those. Um, I'm I may be being slightly facetious there. I think I know what you mean as to whether we would think about using d12s in Firestorm Armada. Personally, I think that's a great idea. And we have toyed around with that. We have toyed around with using different dice, and different dice do give us a greater variety of results. But ultimately, when it came down to looking at what we wanted to keep about Firestorm Armada, one of the core things that we felt made the game feel like Firestorm Armada was the fact that you're using pools of dice, pools of d6 to generate hits, and you get exploding hits, and you're trying to breach the hull of the opponent to do damage. So that's a fundamental thing. And I think if we were to go away from that, it would really not feel very much like Firestorm Armada. So that was one of the things we decided to keep in there. But yeah, I love a D12.
All right, and we got a shout out from a fellow game developer, Red Sky Games. Just wanted to say, as a fellow studio game dev and one who's tackling space combat in my own way, it would be good to see some more games in this particular field. It's a tough gig, and it's one I think that's so easy to go and get two very different games out of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any mechanisms that are used in games are really interesting, and the more I work on developing games, the more interesting I find them, because you, you know you can essentially build a game from nothing, from the ground up, quite easily, and you find that things start to hang off it, and ultimately all you need are variables. You're just finding ways to have a random outcome to something, um, but you're still playing the odds at the same time. So you know that if you've got a handful of 18 dice, that should do something. That should have an effect in the game. Whereas if you've only got three or four, you're almost to the point of, do I even roll these dice? And we want to avoid that for a start, because we don't want that's not a fun that's not a fun experience for any gamer. Is my attacks just aren't worth rolling the dice for. That's No one wants to see that. Um, so yeah, I mean, I I wouldn't obviously I wouldn't like to see a whole a whole load of space combat games out there, especially not miniature based, because um, yeah, that would just mean a lot more competition. But yeah, absolutely, there are so many ways to make games interesting, and they don't have to be the same. You know, you can have card-driven games, you can have um, damage boxes. Some people enjoy those, and I remember playing games, um, 25 years ago, where you it can take 10 minutes to resolve the attacks of just one particular weapon against the ship, because you're rolling random targeting results on different areas of the ship, and then your opponent has to tick off a number of boxes that indicate a hull damage in that particular zone, and you become dice blind, and you're rolling the same dice over and over again, and it just becomes a real tedious exercise and not fun at all for anybody involved. Um, but fortunately, those games don't tend to stick around for very long. So, and things have moved on. The games are a lot more eloquent these days. There are more innovative systems. There are some real fun ways to make games exciting and interesting.
Well, we've kept I think we've kept you up long enough. Just have one more question. Some people in the chats have been trying to figure out what shirt you have. So this is from Genevieve H. Okay, off topic, but is Chris Pond wearing a Mandalorian shirt or Lion King?
Do you know what? I do have a Mandalorian shirt, and I'm not wearing it tonight. It's just a generic kangaroo poo t-shirt. Um, that's the make. Not what it's made out of. It's the brand. So, but no, I do have a Mandalorian t-shirt that has a very similar color at the top, but I'm not wearing that today.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Chris. We'll be doing this again, right? I don't know if it'll be you, Stuart, or somebody else from the shop, but we'll definitely be doing this again.
I look forward to it.
And just for everybody, I've been posting these up. But if you're going to leave feedback, the address is there, www.Firestorm Armada. That's feedback for the beta. If you want to get into the group, if you're not actually watching that on the group and you're on another Facebook place or on the YouTube, it's www.facebook.com/groups/Firestorm Armada. And lastly, that's the address for Warcradle Studios, and they have a ton of great games. You got to check them out. So thank you very much, Chris. We'll be
Thank you, Chris.
Doing that again. And as always, have a great day. Actually, for you, it's a great night, right? Thank you for taking the time out of your evening for this. And
yes, way past my bedtime.
Yeah, have a great night. I will talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
And Chris, stay on the feed when I end the broadcast. Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.